Why Alcatraz is still America's scariest prison. Alcatraz. The name alone sends a chill down the spine. Sitting on a rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by freezing water and dangerous currents, it was once the most feared prison in America. Officially, it was built to hold the worst of the worst: bank robbers, killers, and mob bosses who couldn't be controlled anywhere else. But the truth is, Alcatraz became more than just a prison. It became a legend, a place where fact and fear mixed until no one could tell where history ended and horror began. The prison opened in 1934, at the height of America's battle against organized crime. Almost immediately, it gained a reputation as a fortress no man could escape. Guards carried loaded rifles, watchtowers surrounded the island, and the cold, brutal water made swimming away almost impossible. Inmates were cut off from the world, close enough to see the bright lights of San Francisco, but trapped in darkness and despair. Among the most famous prisoners was Al Capone, the notorious Chicago mob boss. Once one of the most powerful criminals in the country, Capone was reduced to a broken man on Alcatraz. Fellow inmates said the isolation drove him mad. He was seen talking to himself, strumming a banjo, and muttering about shadows that followed him in the night. Some even whispered that Capone claimed to hear voices echoing from empty cells, taunting him until he begged for peace. Another feared inmate was Robert Stroud, better known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. Stroud was violent, unpredictable, and feared by both guards and prisoners. While he was never allowed to keep birds at Alcatraz as he had in other prisons, legends grew about him. Some swore his ghostly figure was later seen walking the corridors, long after his death, muttering in the same cold, flat tone that made guards nervous during his lifetime. But it wasn't only the inmates who felt Alcatraz's grip. Guards themselves admitted the prison had a strange energy. In reports that were quietly filed away, officers described sudden cold spots, the sound of footsteps when no one was there, and distant screams in the dead of night. One guard claimed he saw a man in 19th century military clothing vanish into thin air near the old gun gallery, as if the island itself held onto every soul that had ever suffered there. Then came the escape attempts. More than 30 men tried to break free from Alcatraz. Most were caught or killed. The water swallowed many who dared to swim, and their bodies were never recovered. The most famous attempt was in 1962, when Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers dug through the walls of their cells with homemade tools. When guards checked in the morning, all they found were dummies made from soap and paper stuffed into the beds. The men had vanished. Officially, the government claimed they drowned, but no bodies were ever found. Some believe they made it, others say the bay claimed them, and still others whisper that something darker kept them from leaving. The haunting reputation only grew after the prison closed in 1963. Tourists who now visit the island report strange experiences, the clanging of cell doors, the feeling of being watched, and whispers echoing in the old D block, known as the Hole. The D block was where prisoners were sent for solitary confinement. In total darkness, some men claimed to hear breathing in the cell with them, or to see glowing eyes in the black. One prisoner even screamed that something inhuman was attacking him. By the time guards opened the door, he was dead, his face twisted in terror. To this day, visitors say that cell is colder than the others, as if the air itself remembers his fear. Alcatraz was supposed to be unescapable, but in truth, it was also unforgettable. It trapped not just bodies, but minds. It broke spirits, destroyed sanity, and left behind something that even time has not erased. And yet, this is only the beginning. Because what makes Alcatraz America's scariest prison is not just the criminals who live there, or the legends of escape. It's the belief, whispered among guards, prisoners, and visitors alike, that the island itself is alive, that once you step inside, Alcatraz never truly lets you go. Alcatraz was not just a prison, it was a machine designed to crush the human spirit. The rules were strict, the punishments severe, and even the smallest mistake could mean days in isolation. For some prisoners, this place became more terrifying than death itself. One of the most feared locations inside was D Block, the solitary confinement wing. Here, men were locked in tiny cells with almost no light, no sound, and no contact with the outside world. Meals were slid through a slot, and some cells were kept in total darkness. Prisoners called these cells holes. Guards claimed they were necessary to maintain discipline. But stories soon spread that the holes held something far more sinister than silence. Inmate accounts described icy drafts moving through sealed walls, phantom footsteps pacing outside locked doors, and whispers in the darkness that came from nowhere. One prisoner, placed in the hole for fighting, screamed for hours that a creature with glowing eyes was in the cell with him. The guards thought he was trying to trick them, until his screams stopped suddenly. When they opened the door, they found him lying lifeless on the floor. His body showed no signs of struggle, but his face was frozen in horror. The official report listed heart failure. Other prisoners believed the hole itself had taken him. But D Block wasn't the only place with shadows. Inmates also spoke of the shower room. It was one of the few places where men were forced to gather, stripped of privacy. The sound of running water echoed like a tunnel, and some said voices led through the pipes, voices that didn't belong to anyone in the room. One man refused to enter, claiming he felt cold hands pushing him down when no one was near. The guards, tough men who rarely admitted fear, also had stories. Some reported hearing banjo music late at night, even after Al Capone was too ill to play. Others said they saw shapes moving across the catwalks when all prisoners were locked in their cells. A few even confessed to feeling watched during roll call, as if the prison itself was counting heads alongside them. But among the most disturbing events were the escape attempts. Each time someone tried and failed, their fate became a cautionary tale. In 1946, one of the bloodiest attempts took place, remembered as the Battle of Alcatraz. It began when a group of inmates overpowered guards and tried to break into the gun gallery. Gunfire echoed across the cell blocks, and Marines were eventually called in to storm the prison. By the end, 2 guards were dead, and 3 inmates were killed. But survivors swore that after the battle, the prison changed. Guards said the cell block where the fight took place felt colder than the rest, and some refused to patrol there alone. Visitors today say they hear distant gunfire or men shouting orders, as if the battle replays itself on endless loop. One of the survivors of that failed escape was Clarence Carnes, the youngest inmate ever at Alcatraz. He was only 18 when he entered the prison, sentenced to life. Carnes later told interviewers that he believed Alcatraz was cursed. He claimed men who tried to escape weren't just fighting guards and water currents. They were fighting the island itself. "It doesn't let anyone go free," he said. His words would haunt those who read them years later. But the most famous escape attempt still remained the 1962 breakout by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. Even today, the question of whether they survived divides experts. The FBI declared they drowned, yet no bodies were ever found. Some believe they reached land and lived in secret. Others claim they never made it, out of the dark water. Still, there are those who whisper that the bay was not the only danger, that the same shadows that haunted the prison followed them into the waves. For the guards who stayed after the breakout, the nights grew even longer. Reports of cold spots, moving shadows, and strange noises increased. One guard swore he saw men walking down the corridor in striped uniforms, long after Alcatraz had closed. He thought they were intruders until they vanished before his eyes. Alcatraz was a fortress built on rules, walls, and iron bars. But the deeper you go into its stories, the more it feels like something else was at work. Something beyond human control. Something that made sure every cry, every scream, and every desperate prayer still lingers in the air. And in the years after the prison closed, when tourists first began to walk its halls, many would discover that the ghosts of Alcatraz had not left. When Alcatraz closed in 1963, the government called it progress. The buildings were too old, the cost too high, and the morale too low. But closing the prison didn't silence it. It only made the island quieter, too quiet. Soon after it reopened as a tourist attraction, new stories began. Not from criminals or guards, but from ordinary people who came just to see the rock, as it was called. What they found was something they couldn't explain. Visitors were the first to report strange feelings inside the cell blocks. Some said they felt watched. Others said they heard voices whispering in empty corridors. A few fainted without warning. Guides brushed it off as nerves, saying the atmosphere of Alcatraz could make anyone uneasy. But then, recordings began to surface. Tourists with handheld cameras captured faint sounds, footsteps, doors clanging, even the echo of men shouting far in the distance when no one else was there. One of the most famous stories came from a park ranger named John Bennett. He worked the night shift, locking up the buildings after visitors left. One evening, while closing the old hospital wing, he heard a banjo playing faintly down the hallway. The tune was slow, haunting, and familiar. Bennett froze. He knew the story of Al Capone, the mob boss who had spent his final years on Alcatraz strumming a banjo in the prison's shower room. But the hospital wing had been empty for years. When Bennett followed the sound, it stopped. The hallway was silent again. He never worked that shift alone after that. Ghost tours soon became one of the island's biggest draws. Guides told tales of phantom guards still doing their rounds, and prisoners seen standing behind bars that no longer held anyone. The most haunted area, they said, was still D Block. Visitors described sudden drops in temperature and unseen hands brushing against their skin. Some claimed to hear breathing in their ears or distant cries in the pitch-black cells. One woman on a tour fainted after feeling a man's breath on her neck when no one was near her. In 1984, a television crew from a paranormal show came to film inside Alcatraz. They brought cameras, recorders, and temperature sensors. The crew expected old myths and creaking sounds. Instead, they got something else. During filming, one cameraman captured a faint figure moving across the corridor in D Block, just before the lights flickered off. When they replayed the footage, the figure was there for only 2 frames, tall, human-shaped, and completely black. The crew refused to stay overnight. Years later, another investigation by paranormal researchers used high-tech audio recorders. In the isolation cells, they captured something chilling, a voice whispering the words, "Let me out." The team was so shaken that they ended the session early. They checked the audio repeatedly, convinced it was interference. But the whisper repeated on every playback. Tourists weren't the only ones disturbed. Even scientists and historians who came to study the prison admitted to strange experiences. A researcher from San Francisco State University reported that her equipment would shut off near certain cells and that her compass spun wildly inside the dining hall. Another visitor claimed he saw a man in a guard uniform step out of a doorway and vanish when approached. The mystery deepened when the Coast Guard began getting distress calls from around the island, untraceable signals that would appear and vanish. Once, a transmission came through of a man shouting, "They're escaping! Open fire!" The same words believed to have been spoken during the Battle of Alcatraz in 1946. The call ended in static. The Coast Guard searched but found nothing. Despite its beauty, Alcatraz is not a peaceful place. The cold wind from the bay seems to carry echoes of the past. The clanging of cell doors still rings through the corridors, even though the locks have rusted for decades. Some say it's the metal shifting with the weather. Others believe it's the restless souls, replaying their final moments again and again. Today, more than 1 million tourists visit the island every year. Most leave with pictures and stories, but a few leave with something else, a memory they can't explain, a shadow in the corner of their vision, a whisper when they're alone, a hand on their shoulder that vanishes when they turn around. For many, the scariest part of Alcatraz isn't the history of crime or punishment. It's the feeling that the prisoners never really left, that the island itself is still alive, feeding off fear and guarding its secrets as fiercely as ever. And for one tour group that ventured deep into the basement one stormy evening, that theory would soon feel all too real. It was a cold, windy evening when the final tour group of the night stepped off the boat and onto Alcatraz Island. The storm clouds above San Francisco Bay rolled thick and heavy, and the guide, Emily Rhodes, joked that bad weather made the experience extra spooky. The group laughed nervously, but as they entered the prison, the laughter faded into silence. Power flickered across the island as thunder echoed over the water. The lights in the main cell block buzzed weakly. Emily led the group through the familiar route, the shower room, the mess hall, and finally the isolation cells of D Block. As she unlocked the heavy steel door, a gust of cold air swept through the hallway, blowing out one of the lanterns. "Don't worry," she said softly. "That happens all the time here." But it didn't, not like this. The group continued into the corridor, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. Emily pointed to cell 14D, known as the Hole. "This is where some of the worst punishments happened," she explained. Prisoners claimed they weren't alone in there, even when locked in total darkness. A man from the group, holding a camera, asked, "Can we go inside?" She nodded. "If you're brave enough." He stepped in. The cell swallowed him in shadow. For a few seconds, everyone waited for a laugh or a joke, but none came. Then, faintly, his voice broke the silence. "It's cold in here. Feels like someone is breathing next to me." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Emily reached for her flashlight, shining it into the cell. It was empty. The man was gone. Gasps filled the corridor. "Sir?" she called. No response. She stepped closer, but the cell looked completely still. Then the camera he had been holding clattered to the floor from nowhere, spinning on the concrete. Its red recording light blinked once and went dark. Panic rippled through the group. One woman started crying, insisting she saw a hand reach from the shadows before the man vanished. Another claimed she heard whispering behind her, words she couldn't understand. Emily quickly ushered everyone back toward the main block, trying to stay calm. She radioed for backup, but the signal cracked with static. The lights flickered again. This time, all of them went out. In total darkness, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, not from the group, but from somewhere ahead. Slow, heavy, deliberate. "Everyone stay close," she said, her voice trembling. A flashlight flickered back on, its beam catching something in the distance. A tall, black silhouette standing at the end of the hall. The figure was motionless, its shape distorted by the light, but unmistakably human. Then it began to move forward, slow and steady. The group screamed and ran for the exit, their footsteps pounding through the empty corridors. Emily turned back once, and for just a moment, the light from her flashlight passed over dozens of shapes, faint outlines of men in prison uniforms, lining the cells, watching silently. When the storm passed and the power returned, rescue teams found the group outside, shaking and terrified. Everyone was accounted for except the man who entered cell 14D. His camera was later recovered, and when authorities played the footage, it showed him standing alone in the dark, whispering, "Who's there?" Then came a faint reply, not from him, but from deep inside the cell, "Still here." The screen cut to static. Officials called it an accident. They said the man likely panicked, ran into another corridor, and fell into the water, but the tides never brought his body back. After the incident, that section of D Block was closed to the public for months. Workers refused to enter, claiming they heard knocking from inside the walls when no one was there. Some said the smell of cigarette smoke appeared out of nowhere, the kind once used by guards decades earlier. To this day, rangers who patrol the island late at night say they still hear footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. Some even swear they have seen the missing man's shadow pacing along the cells, as if he became part of the prison's history. Another soul claimed by Alcatraz. For most people, Alcatraz is just a tourist attraction, a place of legends and old ghosts. But for those who have walked its halls when the fog is thick and the wind howls across the bay, there's a feeling that never leaves, the sense that the island is still awake, still watching, still waiting. And that is why, even decades after it closed, Alcatraz remains America's scariest prison.